Never make a point without telling a story, and never tell a story without making a point. Communication is like juggling 18 balls at the same time. So one of those balls is body language, one of them is eye contact, one of them is smiling, one of them is not saying ums and ahs. So if you do that a few times a day, you get a lot better at articulating your thoughts.
We should make a short clip out of this and call out Elon Musk and tag him.
He may actually respond.
Yeah, he's on social media like half the day anyway, right? If someone asks you that question in an interview, sell me this pen, how would you answer that?
I would just walk out of the interview. Such an overused question. Because if the person doesn't need a pen, we shouldn't be selling them that pen. But I would argue for 90% of people who are listening to this, it's the opposite problem. They have too many ums and ahs, and their focus should be getting rid of all of them.
Do you have any specific exercise just for getting rid of ums and ahs?
Absolutely. So the trick is to... So a few years ago when I started guesting on podcasts, I sucked. I was really bad. I remember some guy asked me, "Hey Brenden, where does the fear of communication come from?" And I looked at him and I said, "I don't know, man. New York City? You tell me." One of the mistakes I used to make on podcasts is I would monologue for 10 minutes. Especially when there's two hosts. You know, you just sit there and go, "Okay, when is he going to be done talking?"
Well, we'll just interrupt you.
Oh, yeah, that works too. This interview is actually a lot harder than my average interview that I do. Because you guys are asking really difficult questions I couldn't have prepared for.
He just gave you homework now.
You guys are asking a lot of nuanced questions because there's no direct answer to these questions. Like in the context of Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think you can argue both ways.
So what was the formula again? RQ?
Yeah, do you want to hear the other two?
Yeah.
Or are you not going to give away?
No, I'm
all your
happy to share.
Well, if you want the other two, you have to subscribe to his YouTube channel.
We all have that friend who comes up to us at our house or at a bar and goes, "Erica, Abby, you never would have guessed what happened last week." And you're like, "What?" And then they start rambling, and 20 minutes later, you're like, "What's the point of the story? Why aren't they done yet?" And that's because there's no key lesson attached to the story. So the right way to tell stories is to...
In today's episode, we're speaking with Brenden, a renowned social media influencer and master of communication.
We'll delve into how to leverage public speaking to grow your online following and get ahead in your career.
Stick till the end to learn the top 3 exercises to improve your communication skills and why Elon Musk needs to take a public speaking class. Brenden, what mission are you on?
Yeah, absolutely, Erica. You know, for me, my mission is to help the world master the art of communication and public speaking. So when I was growing up as a little kid, I live in Montreal in Canada. Montreal is a city where French is the first language, not English. So I'm not really that good at French, but I studied my whole life in that language. So I had a lot of fear and anxiety around speaking. And that's what really made me passionate about helping other people kind of overcome their speech. And I also have a crooked left arm. So that also pushed me to say, hey, if I could be a great speaker, everyone else could too.
So just to sort of set the scene, why in today's digital world do we care about public speaking?
Yeah, why do we care? Yeah, why don't we just hide behind cameras?
Yes.
Just do the talking head, right? Like we're doing right now.
I mean, you know, the argument I'll make you to is that this is public speaking. You know, public speaking isn't just standing on a stage and giving a talk. I would actually argue public speaking is infinitely more important today than it used to be. Because now, because of social media, you can create video assets and conversations that millions of people across the world can listen to. So if you're talking like this the whole time, it's not really interesting. People won't really pay attention to those conversations. Whereas if you really put in the time to master speaking, whether it's in person or whether it's virtual, I think you can really create a lot of impact today, especially since you don't even need permission to start anything. You don't need permission to start a podcast. You don't need a permission to create content. And I think we live in a really interesting time where we can do that for the world now.
Do you have a specialization or a target or audience that you focus on? Yeah,
for sure, Abby. Yeah, so the piece around targeting is really interesting because for coaching, I serve a very specific group of people who are mostly like immigrant executives and women executives who are looking to go to the next level of their career. That's my private.
Immigrant.
Yeah, yeah. There you go. You got an immigrant and a woman. Yeah.
So we are your target audience.
Yeah, I guess so. And so that's how we were making the decision. Should we be on this podcast? Oh yeah, I noticed there's an immigrant, there's a woman there, so it's perfect for us. But for the social media content, it's not really a demographic. It's more of a psychographic, which is who is really looking to grow in their communication skills. So there's a bunch of different types of people who listen to my free content. There's a high schooler messaged me the other day and says, "Hey, I'm really scared of presenting in my classroom for my teacher. So I'm watching all of Master Talks so I get really confident in presentation." Somebody else is trying to raise millions of dollars of capital for their technology startup. So the person who's watching my content is completely varied. And somebody like was really struggling with their dating life and they're really nervous when they're talking to girls. So they'll watch Master Talk and say, "Oh, I got to get rid of my umms and I got to improve my projection of the voice." So yeah, it's very wide.
Wait, what does that mean? Psychographic? What does that mean?
Psychographic just means, so demographic, Abby, is like their age, right? How old they are, what ethnicity, what do they do for their occupation. Psychographic is like, what do they believe, right? What do they believe about the world? So like this type of person is somebody who wants to keep growing. They have a growth mindset. They believe that they can be great communicators. They believe that communication can change their life. So it's a belief system that they can always keep getting better in life. Whereas there's a lot of people who operate with the opposite mindset, a scarcity mindset, where they kind of just think, "Oh, everything that happens in my life is because of some random luck or something goes on." So that's what I mean by psychographic.
I see.
Yeah.
So you gave 3 very different examples of people of different ages and in very different situations. How is the coaching similar for those 3 different people?
Yeah, that's a great question, Erica. So the way that I think about this is, because I've coached all different types of people. I don't really coach kids that much anymore, but I've worked with a lot of people before I specialized in my private practice. But what I would say is that all of them just need to follow a simple formula, which is if you do these simple exercises, they all get better. And that formula that I'm happy to share is RQV. So I'm happy to share one of them, and if you want the other ones, happy to share that too. So the first one is the random word exercise. So if you take a word like book or phone or Microsoft, or actually Microsoft is a bad example because it's a company name, like blanket or house, and you create a random presentation out of thin air, it really helps you think on your feet. So if you do that a few times a day, you get a lot better at articulating your thoughts out loud. And you do that, like, let's say 3 to 4 times a day. And that works whether you're a kid in high school, whether you're an executive in a company, whether you're somebody raising capital. Everyone's always struggling articulating their ideas. So the exercise works across the board.
Wait, what is that? Can you explain? What do you mean by random presentation?
Absolutely. So rather than explain it, Abby, why don't I just demonstrate it? So pick any word you want for me.
Pen.
Pen. Amazing.
A red pen.
Okay, awesome. So for those listening to the podcast, Abby did not give me the word red pen before this podcast, and watch me give a presentation in 3, 2, 1. I was waking up on a Saturday morning, and I watched the one movie that anybody who wants to be a finance executive or has an interest in money watches. And yes, of course, I'm talking about The Wolf of Wall Street, starred by Leonardo DiCaprio, which tells a story about a man who was so obsessed with money that he'll sell anything to make a quick buck. Whether it's selling a pen, whether it's selling penny stocks, whether it's selling anything to get ahead. And that is the story behind The Wolf of Wall Street. And when I always think about pens, I always think about sell me this pen, a famous sales metaphor that we think through and how we get other people to buy what we believe or buy what we want to sell them. And when I learned from that exercise, because honestly, most people get it wrong, they think selling this pen means forcing the other person to buy a pen, when in reality, sell me this pen is a metaphor to explain who actually needs what we're selling. Because if the person doesn't need a pen, we shouldn't be selling them that pen, whether it's a red pen, whether it's a blue pen, whether it's a yellow pen. So I ask all of you today, how is what you're selling going to help the person you're selling to? And if you can figure out the answer to that question, I think you'll be able to sell any kind of pen to anyone. That's the random word exercise.
That was very
well
good.
Articulated. I'm curious to know, like, if someone asks you that question in an interview, so you're in a job interview, and they, like, a sales related, and they ask you, okay, sell me this pen. How would you answer that?
I would just walk out of the interview because it's just such an overused question. Honestly, what I would say is I would actually just dodge the question. I would say, hey, look, I'm not here to sell pens. I'm here to sell for a sales job specifically. I'm here to sell what we're doing. Here's how I would sell that. So I would just bring with a lot more confidence and authority, because that's what people are looking for in sales jobs. They're not looking for people who are just going to follow the rules, and they're really looking for people who are just there and who are willing to deal with rejection. So I would take a different 180. I wouldn't just answer it textbook. That's the way I would approach it, which isn't super valuable to your audience, honestly.
Going back to so what was the formula again? RQ.
Yeah, do you want to hear the other two?
Yeah.
Or are you not going to give away?
No, I'm
happy
happy to share.
Well, if you want to know the other two, you have to subscribe to his YouTube channel.
No. You know the reason why I don't share it all the way up front is because one of the mistakes I used to make on podcasts is I would share all of it and I'd monologue for 10 minutes. And then the other, especially when there's two hosts, you just sit there and go, okay, when is he going to be done talking? And
well, we'll just interrupt you.
Oh, yeah, that works too.
But it's also good foreshadow too, because now everyone has to keep watching to hear the rest, right?
That's also another secret strategy. So before we get into RQV, let me explain the context behind that, which is communication, Erica and Abby, is like juggling 18 balls at the same time. So one of those balls is body language, one of them is storytelling, one of them is eye contact, one of them is smiling, one of them is not saying ums and ahs. And if you try and practice all of them at the same time, all of the balls fall to the ground. So the question that RQV helps us answer is, what are the 3 easiest balls to juggle? Because if we know what are the 3 easiest balls, then we know what to work on as soon as this podcast is done. So we talked about R, which is the random word exercise. So I just did this. Don't compare yourself to me. Just start doing it. Do it every day. You'll get better at it. Next is Q. So Q is the question drill. So a few years ago when I started guesting on podcasts, I sucked. I was really bad. I remember some guy asked me, hey, Brenden, where does the fear of communication come from? And I looked at him and I was like, I don't know, man. New York City? You tell me. I don't know. So I got really upset because I didn't like not knowing the answer. So every single day, I answered one question for 5 minutes. And if you do this every single day for a year, you'll have answered 365 questions about your expertise, and you'll be bulletproof. And that's the question drill. That's number 2.
Well, or you can just keep going on different podcasts, right?
Yeah, that's how I practice it indirectly, but it doesn't apply for the audience, right? Because they're probably not guessing on a lot of podcasts. But you're right. That's how I practice it. That's true.
So you're saying like pick a random question, or is there a more strategic way to do it?
Great follow-up question, Abby. So you're right. There is actually a strategy behind this. Let me give you a couple of different frames that you can approach this exercise with. So the first frame is if you're somebody who works in a company, wants to get a promotion. So you already know where I'm going with this. Job interviews, right? We always get asked, tell me about yourself. But there's very few people who actually practice that question 25 times. Practice it every day. Make it better. And if you do that, you'll be so good at answering that question. People will hire you after the first question, right? But then day 2, hey, why should we hire you? What makes you different than other candidates? That's frame 1. Frame 2 is the sales call. So if you're listening to this and you're an entrepreneur, you're a coach, and you're selling people all the time on products and services, on the call, let's say you get on a 25-minute call with them, write down the questions that your prospects are asking you and take a step back and look at those questions and say, how can I answer this question better? What's my perfect answer to this question? And then the quality of your conversions will go up. That's frame number 2. And frame number 3 is more on the personal level. What are questions that your wife or your husband or your family or your kids are asking you? And how can you answer those better? So obviously, if a kid is bothering you, let's say you had children, for example's sake, and they came up to you and they said, Daddy, Mommy, what's this thing? And you respond, look, kid, I don't have time for this. Probably not the right answer to that question. So you want to be calmer in the delivery and whatnot. So those are a couple of frames, but there's a bunch more.
So how do you incorporate, like how do you improve if there's no way to get the feedback? Like you're saying, just try to make it better. But is there a way to incorporate feedback as well? Maybe use ChatGPT or something?
That's an interesting thought. So there's different levels of feedback. You know, the point that I was like to drive here, Abby, and I actually mean this genuinely. If you do any of my exercises a lot, you'll probably get better. Am I saying you're going to be the best person in the world at that exercise? Of course not. Whether it's using ChatGPT, whether it's having a friend stare at you, whether it's having a coach yell at you, regardless, of course you'll improve a lot faster. But really, the message I want to send, that I frankly send to people who pay me thousands of dollars, is like, if you just do the random word exercise 100 times, I guarantee that you will be better the 100th time than the first one. It's kind of like social media. I'm sure you've had people on this podcast and you've asked them, hey, what's the best piece of advice you've had when you started posting content? It's not a complicated YouTube algorithm or social media. It's like, I just started posting. I literally sat in my mom's basement when I was 22 years old. I opened my phone and I just made videos. That's it. And I think a lot of people overthink that point.
Yeah. So we
And
go
then,
into the,
yeah, the
V.
RQV, absolutely. So V stands for video messages. So I'll take this a step further. So I created this concept called birthday video messages. So on my Google Calendar, which is on my other screen, it tells me whose birthday is it this week from my personal network. Like people who are clients of mine, it could be like friends of mine from college, family members. And on their birthday, I'll open up my phone, I'll send them a video with a stupid birthday hat on that I spent $10 on from Amazon. And I'll go, guess whose birthday it is today? It's yours. I hope you have a beautiful day. And I just do that with everybody, and I share something I'm grateful for. And the point of the birthday video message is not about being perfect. It's not about smiling correctly. It's not about saying ums and ahs or not saying ums and ahs. It's just about doing it. Most of us have never received a birthday video message in our lives, and it stands out, and it makes people feel really good about themselves. So I encourage you to send one.
Well, we
That's funny
recently
because,
started. Yeah, we have you heard of Loom?
Yeah,
the Loom
absolutely.
videos.
Of course.
Okay, so we recently started. Like we used to send thank you cards for Christmas presents, and I would always complain to Erica, that's so outdated. We should do like why can't we just send a text message or an email or phone call? But now we have a better solution: Loom videos. Right?
You to
You will
them.
also receive one,
Oh.
by the way.
And
Well, we send it to all the podcast
Yeah.
guests as well. So one follow-up questions, the ums and the ahs. You don't want to be too perfect, right? Like, because then, it almost
Yeah,
feels
that's-
unnatural.
yeah, that's a good point. We got that advice at one point, I think, from someone who was reviewing YouTube videos and said you want to be a little bit imperfect for people to connect with you.
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
It's an interesting thought, right? So here's the way I like to give advice. Whenever I give advice on a podcast, you two, I always think about what does the majority need to hear? Because there's never a piece of feedback that's going to apply to 100% of any population, right? Except maybe like never give up. Actually, even in some cases, there's sometimes you got to give up. Like
Sometimes.
yeah,
You're delusional.
sometimes, yeah. You're like 4'12". Sorry, you're 4'8", and you think you can make it to the NBA. Yeah, maybe not. So the point is, what do I believe? I think most people should probably lower the number of ums and ahs that they say on a general basis. So if you're, like the person said, hey, if you're perfect and you get to a place where you're saying 0 ums and ahs and you want to say 1 or 2 just to be imperfect to your audience, totally fine. And it's really easy for that person to do because they've already perfected it. But I would argue for 90% of people who are listening to this, it's the opposite problem. They have too many ums and ahs, and their focus should be getting rid of all of them, or at least striving for that. So that way, if they want to add some later, that's totally fine. So yes, I definitely believe that the bigger mistake is just saying too many of them.
Do you have any specific exercise just for getting rid of ums and ahs?
Absolutely. So the trick is you need to replace your ums and ahs with pauses and silences. So let's say we go, John loves apples. Instead of going, you want to try this. John loves, don't say it, apples. So you really hold it. That's how you get rid of them. There's another strategy that's hard to teach through a podcast, but I'll try my best to explain it, where you're in a room in front of somebody. So you two are actually great examples of you two can do this after the show's over because you're right next to each other. And it's called the forced silence drill. So let's say Erica gives a presentation, and while Erica is speaking, you, Abby, whenever you want her to pause, you point at her. And you keep the pointing, and she has to stay paused until you remove the finger, and then she keeps talking again. And this a willingness to not say ums and ahs gets trained really quickly. So you just get stopped a lot. And then after 5 or 6 stops, you're like, I'm never saying an and ah, and it gets trained out really quickly.
Wait, I'm trying to imagine this. How will that work? Like, so if I'm pointing at you and you're stopping, as in like your natural reaction would be to say ums and ahs because there's a pause?
Exactly. I know it sounds like it doesn't work and it sounds a little weird, but if you try it's really effective. So let's say, for example, once again, this is hard to teach on a podcast. That's why I usually actually don't even talk about the exercise that much when I'm on a pod. The real advice is just replace your ums and ahs with pausing. But let's say I'm coaching somebody in person and I have them give a speech for 5 minutes. I'm noticing they're pausing every 10 seconds or after a certain word. So then when they redo the presentation again, I'll pause them in those places where I see them umming and ahhing. And you'll notice after a few minutes, they're so scared of being stopped that they stop saying ums and ahs. It kind of shocks them into stop doing it.
Wait,
Is it really more like
no, I have a clarifying question. So you're saying you point them when they say ums and ahs or
Yeah.
when they pause?
So there's not like I said, there's actually not really a perfect rule to this. You could do it in either way, shape, or form. But either way, the exercise works. It's worked 100% of the time for the people I've coached. I'll tell you why. Because the person is so scared of being paused that they stop saying ums and ahs. So let's say, for example, I talk like this. James loves apples and he hates going to the park. And then I pause like this. James likes apples and he loves going to the park. So after this happens for a few minutes, you guys just have to believe me, is after a few minutes it just stops.
Yeah, I was also thinking like Barack Obama, he does that a lot, right? Where he would pause for a 2 or 3 seconds. And I'm guessing because he's trying to avoid saying ums and ahs, and silence is more powerful, right?
Yeah, in Barack's case is a little different because since he's mastered his ums and ahs, like I'm sure a long time ago, or else you can't really go for the be president. So him, it's more strategic, right? So he'll have speech writers in the back who write his presidential speeches when he was president, and then he looks at his speech, and then he's the one who's creating where to pause. So let's say I'm giving a presentation and I'm communicating a thought. I'll choose when to pause to create emphasis. But that's really hard to do with beginners. Beginners, it's more just getting rid of the ums and ahs. It's kind of like training, going on a 4-wheel bike and then training yourself to ride a 2-wheeler later.
Right. But the pause is it just for emphasis? Or I always thought the pause was for him to sound smarter so he can collect his thoughts.
Absolutely. And we're both right. So the pause is multi-purpose. Absolutely. Right? And it serves a purpose based on the speech and what you're trying to achieve. So one of them is emphasis. A second one is exactly right, to sound smarter. But to add another layer, it's like when you pause, you reel people into what you want to say next. So if you go like,
Right.
what does he have? I have a dream. Right, and that dream is to blah blah. That's MLK's speech, right? So they use pause strategically to pull you into the key point of the message. That's the second piece, and then the third one is to get rid of ums and ahs.
Right. But does that strategy work on YouTube? Like, since retention is so important, right? Usually you don't want to pause on a YouTube video. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question. You guys are really asking me some interesting questions today that most people don't ask me. So once again, this is an opinion. And the reason it's an opinion is what's fascinating about YouTube and social media creators is there's so many different types of personalities who find success. Like I'm a very extroverted communicator, but there's people who have followings 10 times bigger than me who are completely the opposite, like Roberto Blake and Lana Blakely. They're super introverted people. And they're just talking like this, but they have millions of followers. So I don't think there's a right prescription, but I do think in general, you don't want to pause too much in a YouTube video because you'll lose people, their train of thought. But I don't think pausing now and then is a bad thing. But if you're pausing for 5 seconds, yeah, it's probably a problem.
Although, of course, with YouTube, you can always edit out the pauses.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's probably easier to edit out pauses than ums and
Oh
ahs.
yeah,
So
actually, yeah, that's an interesting thought. Like, do you recommend editing out ums and ahs from a YouTube video, or would you leave them in?
It depends what stage the content creator is at in their journey. So if it's their first year creating content in general, I wouldn't edit out anything. Because the goal for the first year of content creation is not to be famous, is not to grow your following. It's to gain a muscle. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Right now, when I think you guys are at like episode 30 or 40 of this podcast now, and you've been creating content before on others' channels. So for you, when you go and start a podcast, you don't sit down and go, hey, Erica, hey, Abby, should I be creating podcasts? Am I worthy enough to create content? You don't really ask yourself that question anymore because your identity has changed, right? You see yourself as a content creator. So in my case, I've been creating content for 5 years on YouTube and on other social medias. But the first 6 months of, actually the first year of YouTube, I kind of just said, am I really cut out for this? Should I really be doing this? Why are people having me on their podcast? I had a lot of limiting beliefs. Whereas now it's like, I don't really think about it. It's just like a part. It's like, okay, I'm cooking and then I'm doing a podcast. It's like, it's a part of my identity. So the first year, I would do anything to get that person to take action. But then in years 2, 3, 4, and beyond, if they're still creating content and they're still saying ums and ahs, then yeah, I would probably edit them out.
Interesting. Because that's contrary to what we heard from another expert, right? But I guess it depends on the...
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that gets to a question I was thinking is, it seems like in today's, or in social media, there's a heavy emphasis on projecting authenticity. So there seems to be a balance between, you do want to, well, depending on the kind of content you're producing, you do want to project authority in many cases, but at the same time, you don't want to lose your authentic way of speaking. So what's the balance there?
100%. Because I don't think what me and that other person is saying is necessarily right or wrong, right? So what I mean by this, advice is always contextual. So what's my version of this? If you're on like a long form YouTube episode of like 10 minutes, yeah, I don't really say any ums and ahs when I'm speaking because it keeps people's attention. But the other piece to that, which is really important, is let's say you're doing a 2-hour podcast and you say a bunch of ums. Does it really matter to edit them out? Not necessarily. But the key point is when you're clipping podcast clips for social media, I don't know a podcast clip that went viral with ums and ahs in it. Doesn't ring a bell. So
Oh, you mean like a short?
yeah, like a short,
yeah,
like a YouTube short.
Every second.
Okay.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
look up all the podcast clips. I still don't have. I don't know one that comes to mind right now that had a bunch of ums and ahs in it. So we're actually both right in some ways. Where he's right in the sense that hey, let's use shorts because it's easy to understand. We're like, okay, if you do a 3-hour podcast, you don't have to edit out all the ums and ahs in the conversation, sure. But my perspective is okay. But when you're clipping that podcast or social media, you're probably clipping the parts where you're not going for 50% of the clip, right? So there's the balance. So I don't think it's like he's right and I'm wrong, or she right or I'm right and they're wrong. I think it's more just in what context are you applying the advice. But the point is, are you creating content? Yes or no? I think that's the point.
Yeah, I was thinking like if like someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? He has an accent. He says ums and ahs all the time, and all of a sudden he stops. He has all of a sudden he transforms overnight and loses his accent. He's like speaks perfect American accent, no ums and ahs. People would think that's like something weird is going on, and he's not being authentic, right?
Not as because you guys are asking a lot of nuanced questions because there's no direct answer to these questions, right? Like in the context of Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think you can argue both ways. So I don't think it's possible to change his accent completely. That's not a possibility at all. But if he got rid of his ums and ahs, would I think most people would consider him a better communicator? I would. It's kind of like Elon Musk. Elon Musk says a bunch of ums and ahs 50% of the time. So yeah, do I think if he worked with me for 60 minutes and got rid of his ums and ahs, he would sound better? Yeah, I think so. Like I don't think
Elon Musk.
yeah,
Elon Musk, if you're listening to this,
No, but I'm just saying like as
we have Brenden right here.
No, but I'm saying as an example, like people might say, "Oh, he's not authentic," and I'm like, "What are you talking about? Who cares what the minority think? Like the majority think, oh, I can finally understand what this guy is saying." So yeah, so once again, we should never, because I'm seeing this trend right now. Spot. We should never optimize advice for the minority. I think for me, it's more like what applies in the majority of cases. So yes, do I believe in the majority of cases getting rid of ums and ahs is a good thing? The answer is absolutely yes.
So I wanted to go back to your target audience.
Well, before
for
you
your
go back, I just have a thought. I was thinking we should make a short clip out of this and call out Elon Musk and tag him.
He may actually respond. He's on social media a lot.
Yeah, he's on social media like half the day anyway, right?
I guess so.
Not sure how he's running his company, but anyways, Erica, go back to your question.
Yeah. So on the topic of accents, because I know that this was something that was a big deal for you when you first came here.
It's a big deal for all immigrants.
And you said your target audience, at least for your professional coaching clientele, include immigrants. So you've talked a lot about getting rid of ums and ahs, but what is your take on accents?
Accent reduction.
Yeah. Is that important for someone who's just come to the U.S.?
Yeah, fantastic.
Fresh off the boat.
Yeah, fobs. Yeah, so here's the way I think about this. So what immigrants believe is their challenge in communication and what it actually is, I think, are night and day. So here's what an immigrant believes their challenge is. I have a thick accent in my country's language, whether they have an Indian accent, Chinese accent, Taiwanese accent, Vietnamese accent, doesn't matter. And they go, oh, in English, I'm not that fluent in either. That's what they believe their biggest challenges are. But what their real challenges are, from my vantage point, is articulation, pronunciation, and conviction. Articulation, pronunciation, and conviction. So let's say you take somebody like Jack Ma, right, the founder of Alibaba. So if you hear him talk, he's like a billionaire, right? He has a thick, very thick Chinese accent. But you can understand what he's saying. Like, it makes sense what he's saying. His articulation there, he's pronouncing it correctly, and he has the conviction in his voice. So it's not a question of accent reduction in this case. He's communicating in a way where it's just making people go, oh, I can understand what he's saying, makes sense, and he's confident. Nobody's sitting there and going, I don't understand 90% of what this guy's saying. No. Right. It's the same thing with a lot of top Indian CEOs in the country, like Sundar Pichai or Satya Nadella. Whenever they're communicating, yeah, they have some level of Indian accent, but when they're talking, you understand them because they articulate, they pronounce words correctly, and they have conviction. Whereas a lot of immigrants, when they speak they speak like this. Yeah, this is me, and this is the problem. So that's what needs to be fixed. It's changing their vocal projection, opening up their eyes more, getting them to smile more, so that, yes, they won't have the perfect voice, but they'll share in a way that still gets people convicted in their message.
But what is about the opening of eyes? How does that matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, hard to do for people listening to this podcast, but I'll show an example with my face right now. So if you're presenting like this the entire time, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but your face looks kind of off. It looks a little frozen when you're speaking. Versus if you're really excited about a new innovation and you open up your eyes just a little bit more. You don't have to do this, but if you just open up your eyes a little bit more, notice how my face just looks a lot more excited and expressive, right? So if I take an example like this, good afternoon to the board of directors of Pepsi. My name is Brenden, versus good afternoon to the board of directors of Pepsi. My name is Brenden. There's a big difference in the way that person perceives your message.
And how do you get better at articulation?
How do you get better at articulation? So there's different ways of improving that. My favorite one is the random word exercise. And the reason is because, one, you're learning a new word in the English language, right? Because you have to pick a new word. And you can use websites like randomwordgenerator.com, which is like a random website. And it just helps you find words. And the second piece is what I tell people. If you can make sense out of nonsense, you could make sense out of anything. So if you talk about socks or trophy cases and something that has nothing to do with your expertise, when you go back to something you know, it's going to be very easy for you to articulate your ideas more succinctly and clearly.
Can you give an example? Like, how do you make sense of talking about socks?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So do you want me to do the random word exercise?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I was at a conference last week, and like any other conference, there's always these little booths that are always giving out free things that you can use. So as being the cheap Indian that I am, I always walk around these different booths, and I ask myself, what can I grab today? And I was at a Twilio booth, which is a data management software company. And I didn't really care what the lady had to say, but I really loved their socks because they had little red circles on their socks, and she gave me a pair, and I've been wearing them ever since. And I really enjoy that. And the reason I tell you this is because One man's trash is another man's treasure. To somebody else on the street, these socks are meaningless, but to me, I love the design. I thought they were really fascinating. So, in the same way with socks, what are those little things in your life that you can make a treasure for somebody else? And also, what are the little things that you're missing in your life that you could have more of? And it might not necessarily be a pair of socks. It could be in a video game. It could be an extra cup of tea. And once you find those little things in your life will be better. So notice how I have no expertise in socks, but the fact that I'm able to articulate some random story around the word means when I go back to my subject matter expertise, I'm very confident in that delivery.
Do you have a formula for that? Because it seems like in both cases, you quickly think up of a story, probably whatever first comes to your mind, and then you think of a moral. Is that the
and
basic
also
formula
like
too?
is that a real story, as in like a related story that happened in the past that you are reusing?
Yeah, for sure. So, lot of great questions. Let me tackle each of them individually. So, the first one is a lot of us tend to overthink this question in this exercise. That's actually the number one question I get asked in this exercise. Brenden, what's the framework? What's the formula? What's this? That's not the point of the exercise. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise, team, is to teach us a valuable lesson of communication. That communication in the real world is unstructured. You don't know what's going to happen in your life. You could wake up one morning, something bad happens. You could wake up the next day, hey, my wife is sick. Can you do the sales meeting for me? There's going to be so many scenarios in your life that you won't be prepared for. So the golden rule to the random word exercise is not to do it well. It's to do it a lot. That's why I've done this exercise not 3 times, not 30 times, not 300 times, 3,000 times. Okay, that's how many times I've done this exercise. That's why I'm good at it. Not because I'm special, not because I'm cool, because I've done it a lot. So that's one. The second piece is the reason I don't like to prescribe is because if you gave the same word to everyone, Erica, they would tell you something completely different. So if we take pen, I think of Wolf on Wall Street because I love that movie. Somebody else will talk about, a gift that they got. Somebody else will talk about how when they were growing up as a kid, they didn't really have pens. So the reason I don't like to prescribe is I don't like teaching my way, because my way is not necessarily the right way of doing it. But I'll still happily share it with people. But I think the key is really, as you do the random word exercise a lot, right? Do it 100 times, do it 50 times. You start to develop your own style of doing it. And that's the most important piece. But yes, my signature move with the random word exercise is I always like to start with the story because I think it's more interesting. And then I always drive it to a key lesson that's related to the word that I'm teaching. But you don't have to do it that way.
Right. And going back to my question, are you reusing some of the stories that have actually happened in the past?
Sometimes they're fake stories, sometimes we'll reuse them, but either way it works. So in this case, it was a reuse because I've gotten socks many times because I've done it 3,000 times, right? Right. So, but in some cases, sometimes I get really difficult words I've never done before. So I'll either create a story or I'll try and find a key. But the point is, because I've done it, this is really the point I want to drive for the audience. It's because I've done it so many times, I don't have, or if I did, I have very little fear as to what word will come next. That's the point. The point isn't, did Brenden get a 10 out of 10 on this exercise? That's not the point. The point is, what is Brendan's level of fear associated to the random word exercise? And for everyone listening to this podcast, it's a 10 right now, or a 9, or an 8. But if you do this a lot, it'll go down to a 2. Well, if your fear is going down to a 2 out of 10 on the random word exercise, when you go back to your subject matter expertise, the stuff that you know inside and out, that stuff will be a joke in the boardroom. And that's really the key.
But what if we try to stump you with a random word that you have never, that has nothing to do with anything? Erica, can you think of a random word?
This is the most random words I've ever done in a single podcast. So funny. But sure, I mean, happy to do it.
Brenden is probably never. Can we think of a word?
Can we think of a word that he's never heard of before?
Like he has never had interacted with in his daily life.
He's done this 3,000 times.
Erica, I'm putting you on the spot. You have to deliver.
Well, I should have been looking up the scientific names of various animals before this.
Well, so obviously, if I don't understand the word, I'm allowed to look up a definition,
Yeah.
right? Or else, or else the thing doesn't make sense. But the point that I want to, I'm happy to do it again. But I think the point that I want to drive for people is like just practice this, right?
Mhm.
Practice this. It sounds like a silly exercise, but if you do it a lot, nothing scares you. And it prepares you for what life has to offer. Like, for example, this interview, which I appreciate, by the way, is actually a lot harder than my average interview that I do. Because most interview I do is just like, they'll just say, oh, nice, random, right? Then they'll move on to the next question. They'll just clap and move on, right? But if I'm not prepared for the harder life, if I didn't do the exercise, I would have messed up this interview. Because you guys are asking really difficult questions I couldn't have prepared for. Does that make sense? So, like, your questions are actually a great example of why the random word exercise is key. Because this, what we're doing right now, is a representation of the real world that I've prepared for. Whereas the world has not prepared for this. So if the world comes on this podcast and they don't do the random word exercise, they'll get completely railed on an interview like this. Because you guys are asking very unique questions that no one can possibly prepare for, which I think is a beautiful thing and really demonstrates the point of this whole conversation.
I thought of a word, by the way. Well, it's not really a word; it's a place. So maybe that's not fair.
What is?
But
Antarctica?
Lake Okefenokee.
There you go, Brenden.
Do you guys want me to do that?
riddle us that. It's a random lake in Georgia, right?
Yes.
Well, but now we gave it away. Now you can pull something from Georgia.
Yeah. I would have
You want
just
to give it a try?
But yeah, of course, I've been happy to. As a kid, I've always been fascinated by strange words. And the first time I got exposed to that was in a movie called Mary Poppins, where Mary comes on the show and goes, extrafragalisespialidocious. And I looked at it and I was like, what? I didn't even know how to pronounce that word properly. And it gave me a lot of insecurity, especially when I found other words like Lake Onofinoki or whatever you guys were pronouncing. I don't even know how to pronounce it. And that's really the point I want to drive is notice how I'm pronouncing, I don't even mispronounce it, but I'm doing it with so much confidence that it doesn't matter. Right? Do you guys get it?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Oh, so can you repeat so you said the three things that you need to focus on is conviction, articulation, and what was the third one?
Pronunciation.
Pronunciation. Yeah, that was the question I was going to have at some point. How is that different from accent reduction? Because when I think pronunciation, I think being able to say the word correctly.
Yeah, we could probably have another expert comment on this. I don't think those things are necessarily related, Erica. So accent reduction is more like the voice, the bravado of your voice, where it's like where some Indian accents, they have a very like odd vocal tone. You know what I'm talking about when you listen to Indian accents, like how it's stereotyped anyways. Whereas Apu from The Simpsons, it was played by a white guy, by the way. Fun fact.
Yes.
Whereas, which is so weird, but in the context of art, pronunciation is more like you're rolling your S's, you're rolling your I's. So instead of saying house, you're going house. So you're not rolling your S or your E. So it's about listening to what the student is saying and then comparing that to what a native English speaker would pronounce that word with and specifically diagnosing that word. And then the way you fix that, which takes a lot of work, is like you'll listen. And if you don't have a coach to do this, you can do this with a native speaker. There's like cool language exchange groups you can have fun with where you kind of teach each other your own language. So you can speak, and then it's easy for a native speaker to listen to you and go like, oh, actually this word, you're not pronouncing it correctly. You're supposed to say it this way. And then you do it slowly. It's called phonetics. And then that person pronounces that word 5-10 times and it'll get fixed 70-80% of the time.
Isn't that what your coach was doing with you, though, for your accent reduction classes?
Yeah.
Or is that just an exercise you started on your own?
Well, yeah, my coach, she basically said whenever you hear something or whenever you're not 100% confident that you're pronouncing the word correctly, you should stop right then and there and look it up, like on Google or there was an app back then that I had on my phone. So I would like stop right there, check the pronunciation, and then fix it right at the spot. And if you keep doing it over and over, it's just a matter of time that most of your words would be
Now I've
correctly
gotten to the
pronounced.
point where you correct my pronunciation.
Yes, right. I taught Erica how to say almond. She used to say
Although we looked it up.
that both of them
Both
are
ways are
fine,
correct.
but almond seemed to be the
Yeah.
correct one according to my app.
That's funny.
Almond without the L.
Yeah, almond without the L.
I think that's
How
great
do you
advice.
say almond?
I think I just say almond.
See?
So maybe I didn't know. Maybe,
But I can't confirm if that's right or not because I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
Well, we just gave you homework now. Or you want to go over? Do you have pending questions?
Well,
you
I
wanna
was just
cover?
going to then, we covered one of your two main clientele groups, but you also work with executive women. And so I'm curious what advice you give executive women, or what is it that executive women think they're doing wrong that they're actually not? And what are they missing?
Yeah, fantastic, Erica. So the solution is the same. So I drill RQView with them, the random word exercise, the question drills, the video messages, and that boosts up their confidence over time. But the challenge is a little different. So with an immigrant who's in middle management, the challenge is, I'm struggling with my English, I'm struggling with my articulation. That's what they're really worried about, top of mind. Whereas an executive woman feels left out. It's more of an emotional problem. So what does that mean? That means a lot of women, when they get promoted to VP or SVP in most industries, they're generally the only woman in the boardroom at that point. It's 1 to maybe 3 women, except maybe fashion, but every other industry, it's a male-dominated field, so they feel left out. There's a saying in our industry, which is men get promoted on potential, women get promoted on performance, which is really unfortunate. So a lot of the women I work with, they're really smart people, they're super capable, but they feel that imposter syndrome whenever they're speaking. So when they're working with a communication coach, for them, it's more about finding their mojo back and communicating better than the other men in their company. So they have that confidence that they know they can keep getting promoted and climb the corporate ladder and eventually get into the C-suite.
And I was also curious how you discovered these 3 exercises. Was it something someone taught you, or you came up with them on your own?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of different, everyone learns differently. So there's a lot of great coaches in my field who are more academic driven. So they have PhDs in communication, or they have a master's degree in comms, and that's how they eventually, or in speech pathology. Mine was very different, a different journey. I have a degree in accounting. So most of the things that I learned in speaking, even if I've now I invest in a bunch of coaches and programs to learn from other coaches in my space. But when I got started, it was mostly through application. So, for example, when I was in college and I would coach people, a lot of the stuff I was teaching wasn't working, so I wouldn't teach it. But then there's other things I would say, hey, try the random word exercise. I was kind of like a mad scientist. And I say, oh, this is working. And then I would try it on the 5th person, the 7th person. But then when the 10th person started getting results, I was like, oh, this is consistent across the board. It was the same thing when I started coaching kids the first time. I said, okay, team, let's try this exercise. Let's try this and see what works and what doesn't. And it's really through application that I figured out the knowledge base that I have today. And that's what I then share with the world. So it's mostly through practice, trial and error.
Interesting. Do people also come to you for actual public speaking, like talking in public?
Yep.
And your strategies, you said more or less are the same?
Yeah, it's around 10 to 20% of the client base is public speaking. So it's the same exercises, but then there's a step 2, which is actually teaching them how to curate the talk, how to find the right content for their speech. That we can cover today, but the general idea is, because it's a lot, you could spend 30 minutes just on that piece, honestly. There's so many little details. But the main idea is, when you have a 45-minute talk, instead of trying to present the whole thing at once, you want to present the first 2 minutes 20 times and the last 2 minutes 20 times, like a puzzle piece. So when you're working on a jigsaw puzzle, those little pieces you put together, right, you work on the edges first because they're easier to find in the box. Whereas in presentations, we shove a bunch of content down the middle and we ramble a lot and we get exhausted after one round of practice. We don't want to work on it anymore. Whereas if you do the intro like 10, 20 times, it's 20 minutes of practice, but you feel that confidence. You're like, wow, my intro is so good now. And then you're really able to build on the rest of the presentation.
Well, yeah, one more topic I wanted to talk about, I wrote it down, I forgot to ask. Storytelling. how important is it in like YouTube videos and also in public speaking in general?
Absolutely, Abby. So it's important, but it's vague to coach. So a lot of people, they say storytelling is important, but what do you actually do to practice this? So there's a quick tip I'll give you on this. Les Brown says it best. He says, never make a point without telling a story, and never tell a story without making a point. What does he mean by this? What he means is every great story often has a key outcome or a key lesson attached to it. We all have that friend who comes up to us at our house or at a bar or at a party and goes, Erica, Abby, you never would have guessed what happened last week. And you're like, what? And then they start rambling, and 20 minutes later, you're like, what's the point of the story? Like, why aren't they done yet? Like, I don't get it. And that's because there's no key lesson attached to the story. So the right way to tell stories is to start in reverse. Make a list of lessons that you want to teach other people. What's important for you to teach? Never giving up, that anyone can be a great communicator. And then find the personal story that you think best teaches that outcome. That's the easiest way to practice this for beginners. Obviously, as you get more advanced, you might be able to tie in a lot of things a lot better, and we could spend a whole hour talking about how to do that. But I think the idea is, like, for me, the example I used today is one of my key ideas was, hey, anyone who's listening to this can be a great speaker. Anybody. I don't care who you are, you can be a great communicator. So what's the personal story? Well, my own story. I have a crooked left arm. I grew up my whole life speaking in a second language, and I have a degree in accounting. I think if I can figure this out, anyone can figure this out, right? So there's a link between the story and the key lesson I'm driving.
So is that the similar strategy for a YouTube video?
Good question. YouTube, it gets a lot more complicated. So storytelling on YouTube, especially at the pro level, which I actually don't even do, to be honest. I'm mostly like a how-to channel. That's how we grew, because it's easier for me. But yes, people like Emma Chamberlain, Casey Neistat, Yes Theory are great examples of great storytellers on how to do that. And the trick to that, which is a lot more complicated for today's purpose, is like what they do is it's called storyboarding. So you storyboard an adventure that your audience goes on throughout the day. And this is very popular, let's say, in the vlogging community. Casey's a great example of this. Okay, this is my day in New York. Okay, what happens in my day in New York? I go to this park. I hang out with my wife. I have dinner with my kids. This happens. And then you film key parts of each of the moments that you're capturing. You tie it all together. That's how you storyboard for YouTube.
How would you incorporate that in a podcast like YouTube video?
The way I would approach it, so the lens I would tackle that question from Abby is really, what are the best podcasters on the planet doing? Interview style podcast. And this is my personal opinion. I really like Stephen Bartlett. I really like Lewis Howes. I think these two guys are really solid. I like Dax Shepard a lot. I think he's really good at driving conversation. So when you're listening to these podcasts, it really gives us an angle on how they're approaching. So everyone has a different style. Some are more free flowing, like Joe Rogan, where they kind of just let the conversation organically go. And there's other people who have a very specific story on where they want the audience to go and the guests to go. Guy Raz is a great example of this. I think How I Built This is the podcast, where it's like he's like having you on specifically to talk about how did you build this company or this thing. So he has a very specific question. The whole story is outlined from the day you were born all the way to the day that you are. It's pretty wild. Like, you guys should watch his people want to learn. It's very extreme. It takes a bunch of time to research and produce. Like, Gary Vaynerchuk was on Guy Raz's podcast. I listened to that. I was like, how does he even know all this stuff about Gary? It's ridiculous. And so there's different levels. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think the key is you do it a lot and you find your style over time.
Thank you so much for coming on, Brenden. We learned a lot about communication, and we have some homework that we need to do with the RQB exercises. But for anyone who wants to learn more, improve their communication, maybe work with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Absolutely, too. Thanks for making this such a fun intro. And honestly, I got some homework too. I need to figure out how to pronounce almond. So let's see how that goes. But yes, for people who want to keep in touch, very simple. Just go to my Instagram. It's Master Your Talk. So that's YOUR, Master Your Talk. And just send me a DM and let me know what you thought of the episode. I always like to hear from you. So just send me a quick text and I'll respond with a voice note.